Good evening, everyone, and a very warm welcome here at the library of the Goethe-Institut Mueller Bhavan in Mumbai. The State of Nature in India lecture series aims to provide a multidisciplinary platform that looks into how society, economy, and the environment are interlinked in the age of the Anthropocene. The focus is on India. This evening, we would like to welcome Sheba Chhachhi, who will talk about the feminine mythology of nature in Indian cultures, followed by a discussion with Ravi Agarwal and a Q&A session. Sheba Chhachhi is an artist, photographer, and thinker who investigates questions of gender, eco-philosophy, violence, and visual cultures with emphasis on cultural memory. As activist and photographer in the women's movement in the 1980s, Chhachhi moved on to create intimate sensorial encounters through large-scale multimedia installations. Her work interweaves the mythic and the social, pre-modern thought and contemporary concerns, bringing the contemplative into the political. She has exhibited widely, including the Guangzhou, Taipei, Moscow, Singapore, and Havana Biennales. Her works are held in significant public and private collections, including Tate Modern, Kiranada Museum, Singapore Art Museum, Devi Art Foundation, and the National Gallery of Modern Art. Chhachhi speaks, writes, and teaches in both institutional and non-formal contexts. She lives and works in New Delhi. Thank you very much for coming tonight. The series is conceptualized in collaboration with Ravi Agarwal, who has an interdisciplinary practice as an artist, photographer, environmental campaigner, writer, and curator. His work explores key contemporary questions of ecology, society, and capital. It has been shown widely in Asia as well in Europe. Ravi is the founder, director, and director of the environmental NGO Toxics Link. He serves on policy and regulatory committees and boards, writes extensively on sustainability issues, has co-edited books on these topics, and received several awards for his work. Thank you all for coming tonight, and I wish all of you an insightful and inspiring evening. Thank you.
Thank you all for being here. Thanks to the Goethe-Institut and Ravi Agarwal for inviting me to continue some of the thinking that came up in the State of Nature conference that was held here last year, which was an extraordinary exchange of ideas and very fertile, rich experience. I'd like to start with giving you a description of an image which appeared in the newspapers in early November. I'm giving you a word picture, but you may well have seen this. A number of women, 3 to 4, dressed in bridal finery, holding coconuts, flowers, and incense in their hands, standing thigh-deep in what should be water but is actually foam, gazing up at the sky. This is an image of women, and they were lakhs of devotees, offering Chhat Puja. Chhat Puja is basically an offering and a salutation to the sun, to the life-affirming capacities of the planetary body of the sun, performed despite the condition of great contamination of the river, the smog, the conditions of extreme pollution, which always sort of drown Delhi come October, November, from Diwali onwards. So when one looks at this image, what does one actually think? Do you think that this is the power of faith and devotion, resisting all odds, overcoming hazardous conditions? Does one think it's a clash, the classic clash between tradition and modernity? Or does one think this is actually a form of ignorance where these people are standing in toxic water and doing a form of nature worship? When I look at this, what I see is an assembly of lost bodies. The sun, who cannot be seen, survives only as an idea in the mind of the devotee. The devotee is looking up at the sky where all she sees is actually grey smog, but in her mind is perhaps an image of Surya Dev or of the sun. She gazes upwards as though she could see the sun. She stands in poisoned foam as though it was sacred water. She chants prayers as though her lungs were not choked. How has the as though, the virtual, the idea, created this rupture between our actual experience of the actual material conditions? This image for me is emblematic of this rupture, which seems to inform our behavior in the current ecological crisis. What has produced this condition? The condition of rupture, the rupture between nature, culture, nature and humans, is something that has been analyzed and theorized in a number of ways. And I'm going to just very briefly refer to the ideas that have come up around the naming of this epoch as the Anthropocene. A group of scientists, geologists, geoscientists, proposed that this be called the Age of Man, because the kind of impact that humans have had on the planet has superseded any other kind of impact, and therefore it should be renamed as the Anthropocene. In this new planetary age, humanity is cast as a single geological force, a major force of environmental destruction and one folding in on itself. The Anthropocene is famously defined by human-induced climatic, biological, geological transformations of our planet by a profound anthropogenic environmental impact and mass species extinctions. However, the Anthropocene is a way of conceptualizing, thinking about this. As it gained traction outside the geoscientists, but came, in fact, into the environmental and ecological debates, was critiqued, as pointed out by a wide range of feminist philosophers and critical scholars. The Anthropocene actually hides troublesome differences between humans, and also hides intimate relationships between technology, humans, and other animals. Feminist thinkers have taken issue with the idea of the Anthropocene almost since its inception. The human as a geological force, to name the human as a geological force is to mask the fact that not all humans share equal responsibility for the current course of destruction. Moreover, the processes of industrialization, colonization, urbanization and extractivism, which lie at the heart of the idea of the Anthropocene, as an epoch, are clearly bound up with issues of gender, race, class, and colony. At one level, failure to name the force more precisely takes crucial attention away from the specific anthropogenic activities and relations that are the largest engines of planetary ruination. What is proposed as a perhaps more accurate reflection is the Capitalocene, which speaks of the specific form of global economic and social organization that is capitalism, in which the planet and its human and more than human inhabitants are arranged and exploited primarily to be singled out primarily in order to maximize wealth and power for the few, should be singled out for its transformative effects. Another proposal of the Plantationocene, which focuses on colonization, agricultural practices, and apparatus, both material and ideological, which have had a critical, irreversible impact on the earth. Feminist thinkers point out that the monolithic human behind the Anthropocene is really just another version of the white, male, colonizing modernist man in disguise. He is a part of the problem himself. This man fashions himself as separate from and over and above a feminized nature. Nature comes to be treated as nothing but a universe of inanimate raw materials whose sole purpose on earth is to fuel his interests. Ecofeminists have long drawn parallels between patriarchal control, subjugation, and exploitation of women, pivoting around their bodies and their capacity to reproduce, with the subjugation, the conquest, the ownership, and exploitation of the earth. Donna Haraway presents an alternative, perhaps more hopeful conception, a way to think about the present condition in what she calls the Thulacene. Essentially, it asks us to look at the web of relations, of sociality and relationality between the human, the non-human, the more than human, the less than human, as a way of thinking which could probably produce alternative ways of responding and acting. All these ideas are useful for us in trying to kind of come to grips with our condition. Coming out of these debates, certain key areas have been spoken of. Multi-species, the relationship between humans and non-humans or other than humans. Biodiversity, the sentience of trees and plants. Codependence, to name just a few. Now, when I think about these, I find that a number of these ideas actually find resonance in pre-modern knowledge systems. These systems describe modes of relationships between humans and non-humans, between humans and the earth, which seem to actually reflect these propositions. They're often garbed in myth, covered up in ritual practice, but they are extant. They continue to exist, they continue to be practiced. The image of the Chhat Puja that I spoke of, at some level is a horrifying image, but it also speaks of a recognition of the life-affirming forces of the sun and water. And this is a ritual that probably carries over from even pre-Hindu times, from animist and tribal worship of the primal forces of nature. Let's just briefly look at the idea of multi-species and what sorts of articulations of multi-species relationships we find within pre-modern Indian thought. We have practices of feeding, which continue to this day. Feeding crows, feeding ants, feeding even, as the famous Shyal Bhog in the eastern part of the country, even foxes, turtles, all manner of birds, and of course cows. Then we have the galaxy of hybrid gods, gods that are part animal and part human. The most obvious and most popular are Ganesha, Hanuman, Narasimha, to name only a few. The 64 yoginis, each yogini actually carries the head of an animal. So this kind of merger, this meeting of what is non-human, not human, and the human to create a composite entity which partakes of both is something that is very much part of our thinking. It's something that we absorb, grow up with, and find proliferating in images and practices, both in rural and urban India. Taxonomies of matter from ancient proto-scientific texts, from Jaina cosmology, describe the interlinked chain of being from insect to human, where each form contains the other. We have these rich images of bodies containing the bodies of other species. Stories of exchanges between human and non-human, myths, folk tales, statues. Possibly these represent an absorption of tribal animist practices which seem to have then been subjected to the institutionalized, I've written to the mixer grinder of institutionalized religion and with its attended power structures. The feeding of other species itself becomes a kind of karmic banking, a sort of, credit input into good deeds. Taxonomies are hierarchicalized, where you had a conception of each being actually containing the other. Now a hierarchy is created where, of course, the human and the male human is at the top of the ladder, the top of the pyramid. Rebirth as a lowly animal is to be avoided at all costs. This is no longer something that you think of as a potential form of being. So we have, it's for me a fascinating kind of complex mix of ideas. In the global discourse, there's a huge turning to indigenous communities, to peoples who have kept some of these practices and these ways of understanding nature and these modes of relationship with nature. Here we have so many, and the multi-species was just one example, but they have been altered, distorted, and while they continue to be practiced today, somewhere the nuggets of ecological wisdom have gotten obscured, occluded, under the garb of commodification and rigid ritualization. A lot of it generated, created, constructed through the institutions of religion. To look briefly at trees, trees are considered sacred in many, many parts of the country. In Himalayan villages, I have seen an extraordinary deodar, I think almost 50, 60 feet tall, surrounded by offerings. The practice there is to actually request a particular deodar tree to act as a protector of the village. And annual festivals and annual offerings are made to the deodar, who becomes like a guardian of all the inhabitants of that village. Who would cut that protector down? I think we've had quite a dramatic series of events in Bombay itself. Today we may have more secular scientific reasons to protect our trees. We may tell ourselves it's for these other ecological reasons, but essentially the principle is not dissimilar. There are resonances between these. In mythic lore, if the Ashoka tree is kicked by a menstruating woman, it bursts into bloom. Look at the consonance between bodies there. We have ancient sculptures depicting the goddess with a tree emerging from her vagina, Sakambari. Now, of course, this is decently covered over with silk and flowers. Such images, symbols, myths, and stories abound. They seem to describe a symbolic realm within which many nuggets of eco-philosophy lie embedded. And many practices linked to these are extant in both urban and rural communities today. But like Sakambari, covered up garbed, reified, altering their articulations. Let us return to Delhi, where I live and work, which has now the dubious distinction of being the most polluted city in the world. Earlier, Beijing held that honor. We've now beat China. In fact, in Beijing in 2014, there's a strange connection with the Chhath Puja. They began to televise the rising sun in big public parks because people just hadn't seen the sun for so long. And it was producing a whole lot of social unrest, so they were televising on these large digital screens which were placed all over Beijing where the populous citizens could actually see the sunrise. So returning to Delhi and returning to her river, the Yamuna, where a lot of my attention has been focused over the last 10 years or so in my art practice and in trying to think about these issues. The Yamuna today is a stinking Nala. She is no longer a river. The indifference of the city of Delhi, both of its governance and its citizens, to the willful, orchestrated destruction of it is unbelievable, and it continues despite all the promises, the huge amounts of funds allocated for the cleanup, etc., etc. The river moves forgotten beneath bridges reverberating with the haste of daily aspiration, remembered only for the enactment of a half-remembered ritual that needs her waters to be completed, either birth or death, now more and more only death. Yet, in the mythic imaginary of religious, communitarian and popular culture, the goddess Yamuna, for the river is also a goddess, is not only alive, but resplendent. Every morning, a chant is sung to her, praising her from the Yamuna Ashtakam. I quote, it's very flowery. O Yamuna Devi Ji, your waters fragrant with forest blossoms, you cascade down Mount Kalinda, crystal white your flow, luxurious with parrots, peacocks, swans as loving friends, your waves are bangles, the sand gems, your banks curve like beautiful hips. One who sips your waters fears not Yama, the god of death, for you are his beloved sister. Your water is the love juice of the gods. In them one experiences divine erotic bliss. O daughter of the sun. Composed in the 14th century, this song is still sung every morning along the banks of the Yamuna. The Yamuna is an interesting figure as a goddess, blamed for her incestuous desire for her brother. Both of them were born of the sun. She appears as both lover and mother. She was the lover of Krishna, dark, unlike the fair white Ganga, sexual, active. The huge repository of texts and ritual practices which inform her worship reveal a rich, embedded eco-philosophy, articulating an ideal mode of being in relation to the river and to nature. Why does this not translate into eco-conscious behavior? Why does the devotee seem indifferent to the fact that the river is dying? Why is there this disconnect between the ecological wisdom embodied in our cultural practices and current environmental conditions? Is it possible to simultaneously worship and destroy? In fact, when one begins to unpack this a little further, you find that the sacralization of the river, the conceptualization of nature as the material feminine, whether as Bhu Devi, Bharat Mata, Anna Devi, or the goddess Yamuna, Prakriti herself, does not necessarily contribute to any significant ecological benefit. Possibly this even undermines the potential capacity. The ideal of motherhood, enshrined in Hindu kinship systems, is actually based on characteristics of negation and sacrifice. The mother is honored, but this honor is based on her self-negation. The ability to endure privations for the family, the willingness to give sustenance no matter what the sacrifice, with no thought of her own needs. The expectation that the holy site or the divinized, made sacred, feminine aspect of nature will nurture, purify, or perform any other supportive material act without any requirement for sustenance in return. The feminine theology of water and nature works paradoxically. In itself, the act of sacralizing nature can generate both the desire to protect and nurture, as well as obscure the need to protect. The divinity gets dematerialized, separated from the embodied material body, which is the river herself, perceived as all-powerful, meta-human, metaphysical, therefore not needing to be cared for by ordinary mortals. In all of these, I see this rupture, this dematerialization between the actual body and the idealized, virtualized form. If we come to our contemporary lives, we can find a curious parallel of this virtualization, dematerialization, with the kind of relationships or the way that we represent, to take for an example, landscape. Today, our contact with landscape is primarily through high-res media representations and increasingly through satellite imagery. Whether it's your GPS on your phone, it creates a different relationship, a different kind of embodiment to navigate any space, even a space that you're familiar with, but you actually move through very differently because it is now taken another form which is separated from the materiality of actually walking through those spaces. Spectral imagery of water and land resources created by visual technologies linked to surveillance and military use, technologies of seeing which are devoid of human agency, have superseded previous modes of representing the earth. Historical shifts in landscape practices offer an interesting lens to examine the semiotics of our relationship to the earth. Within Euro-American culture, the earliest frescoes of Greek and Rome gave way to oil-painted assertions of land ownership in 16th, 17th century Europe. In the dominant genre painting of that time, naturalist taxonomies of the early 19th century to 20th century American Romanticism, and then, of course, glossy, hyper-real National Geographic photographs, to today, the ubiquitous aerial view. On the other hand, pre-modern Aboriginal bird's eye view, Dreamtime paintings, or carved Maori Wakapapa sticks, a taxonomic framework that links all animate and inanimate phenomena in the terrestrial and other worlds, provide different mediations of natural and cultural forces. Similar conceptions invigorate the various painting traditions of Adivasi tribes, Gond, Bhil, Warli, and others, where perhaps what is represented is not a realistic understanding of the earth, the land, and all that inhabits it, but a connection that is formed through a different kind of subjective experience and understanding, whether it is mapping energy patterns, mapping flows, mapping the contact between the human and the non-human. In Asia, the earliest forms of landscape were, again, not representatives of the external world, but more portrayals of the inner landscape, whether it's Chinese ink paintings, inner landscape of the artist's mind and heart and soul, because these were usually tied deeply in with spiritual ideas and spiritual conceptions. Metaphors for inner and outer harmony. Allegories, rather than realistic representation. So each mechanism of landscape imaging reveals structures of power and thereby embedded ecological paradigm. I'm actually offering to you different ways of looking at this terrible condition that we're in, different aspects which could enable us to understand and to really try and think about this process of disembodiment. The disembodiment is of the mythic, between the mythic and the material, the disembodiment is also ours. We are equally disembodied in these processes. So we're speaking of several ruptures. With reference to the Yamuna, the rupture between an embodied, powerful goddess to a domesticated, maternalized, pausified goddess. I mean, isn't it very interesting how all the goddesses end up looking the same? They're all fair, with large eyes and full lips. What happened to all the other goddesses? What happened to the fierce Chamundas, the goddesses with protruding teeth and nipples like spears, which were various sort of representations of the feminine, the terrifying, the powerful, the free, the independent. We now have a much more domesticated, spousified goddess. And in fact, if we go into, go back into the history of many of the key goddess figures, you'll find a particular period where they kind of are absorbed into a more patriarchal system. So the rupture, the second rupture between the material body and the idealized, divinized, virtualized body. And for me, this rupture is not just between, say, the Yamuna, the river Yamuna, and the goddess Ramana, but equally happening to us when we are now consuming images of nature through television, through Discovery, through Natural Geographic, through our GPS, etc. The third rupture is a rupture of epistemology, of knowledge systems, where these forms, these practices, these stories, these myths have become reduced to mechanical ritual, commodified religiosity. Is it possible to excavate these nuggets? Is it possible to pull out these kernels of eco-philosophy, of a different attitude, of a different relationship? Is it possible to recuperate these? Is it possible to make them carry more of their originary meaning, or carry more of the meanings that would be useful today in terms of eco-conscious behavior? This is something that I believed was possible, and much of my work actually sought to do that. And I will share a small excerpt of one work just to give you an idea of how I did that. But there are huge dangers in recuperating myths. There is the danger of nostalgia, of yearning back, harking to some kind of golden past. A lot of eco-discourse today tends to valorize the indigenous in those terms, in terms which speak of Mother Earth, which speak of respect, etc. This is not to negate at all the extraordinary battles being fought to protect the land by indigenous communities, particularly, for example, in the US, but to actually question the danger of nostalgia. Is it at all possible to actually return to those conditions from which these knowledge systems appeared? Are we not today, in fact, extending in a different direction, where our bodies are no longer only bodies of flesh, but we have developed technological extensions? We are becoming more and more techno-bodies, cyborgs. I was just looking at Ravi's new iWatch, which tells him his pulse, his heart rate, whether he's had a good night's sleep, etc., etc. So this device is informing you of what you would normally read from your own body. So perhaps we are inhabiting our own bodies differently as well. And this is for me bound up with the question of ecology, because it is about trying to find an embodied, situated, contextual form of knowledge that will enable us to perhaps find some kind of imaginary which can nourish and produce behavior that might alter the conditions we are facing today. I would like to quote Donna Haraway. She speaks of a post-foundational eco-ontology of nature cultures in which the ideal and material are co-agents in the continuing process of creation. Is it possible for us to recuperate so much that we already have embedded in our culture for emancipatory uses? Can we remember, literally put together these bodies again? I'd like to now share a small glimpse, an excerpt of a work. It's a large installation. This installation its first iteration was in the Delhi Public Library, a site not far from the Yamuna herself in Old Delhi, in Shahjahanabad, the old part of the city, where I found, by complete chance, abandoned swimming pool in the basement, or what used to be the basement, of the public library. It was a colonial era pool which was filled with debris, with garbage, and also with remaindered books, all sorts of broken fans, rotting mattresses, old books, all kinds of things. It had at one end a defunct fountain, and for me it was an extraordinary space because the site it stood on was actually the site of a number of waterways that had crossed the area and related very closely to the Yamuna. So I invite you into the water diviner. As you enter a space saturated with blue light. There are mounds and mounds of books, huge piles of them, on which perch some dead fish, skeletons of fish. As you go in, you are destabilized, you yourself become blue. It's a somewhat uncanny kind of experience. As you proceed and you're descending, you're going downwards into the great cavern of the pool, you notice amongst the books illuminated light boxes which carry images of life, of riverine life around the Yamuna, drawn from across many periods of history. The books pile up all around you, and you stop and you look at these illuminated books. I'll give you a close-up. These bring together, for example, a 16th century miniature painting of gopis bathing in the river with the present condition of trash and garbage in the river. It is a profoundly shocking image, especially when you encounter it in this form where you're in this dark blue space and suddenly meeting these glowing illuminated books. As the sound of water pervades the space, just water running, and you encounter a number of these books. These books carry stories. Some of them are animated, like this one. These books carry stories. Perhaps I'll tell you this one. It's a rather beautiful story. Once when Narada was returning from one of his sojourns to heaven, he glimpsed on his way down to earth these very beautiful creatures, but each one of them had something distorted. Something was wrong. So he asked them, "Who are you?" And they said, "We are the notes of music, and every time someone sings out of tune, this is what happens." He was really mortified. He'd sung out of tune himself, as all of us have, and said, "So what would heal you?" And they say the perfect song sung by the perfect singer. So he goes to various gods. He goes to Brahma, who refuses. He goes to Shiva, who agrees to sing. And as Shiva sings, all the assembled gods and devotees liquefy. They turn into water and flow down to the earth in the form of the river Yamuna. This is juxtaposed with statistics on noise pollution from the city of Delhi, mapped across different regions in the city. The image itself is of a woman musician on the banks of the river, and what moves across her are these loudspeakers. Another story that you encounter is about most of the stories of riverine culture around the goddess Yamuna involve Krishna, whose lover she was. So in this story, Balram, who is the brother of Krishna, gets very drunk one day. And he's very hot, and he wishes to bathe. So he yells out to the Yamuna and says, "Come and cool me off." And she refuses, and she says, she's quite offended. I mean, you don't do this to goddesses. And she says, "If you wish to bathe, come to the river and cool yourself off." He puts out his plow, and he's always shown with a plow, and this difference is quite critical because he's a farmer while Krishna is a goat herd, is a cattle herd. And he begins to pull Yamuna towards him with the plow. The image is of dragging a woman by her hair. She begins to split into a number of tiny streams. And there's a long conversation and a long struggle between the two of them, which I won't go into. But she finally realizes that while he may not be able to destroy her, he will reduce her power by turning her into so many small streams. So she acquiesces and floods the forest grove in which he is sitting. Could this be the first dam in history? This image is juxtaposed with the satellite image of the first dam on the Yamuna as she leaves the mountains in Yamunotri, coming down towards the plains and traversing the country. Craggy hillscapes, books, bundles of books tied up, gesturing to abandoned knowledge, gesturing to wisdom that we have but are not drawing upon. Running down the center, a light box which shows a map reconstructed from 1837, which shows the waterways of Shahjahanabad, and in fact exactly where we are standing within the public library site. You see at the far end the fountain with the lion's head, symbol of colonial power, which I activated, and I ran black water through its mouth. And as you proceed and you go downwards, passing through all these traces of the past, all these gestures towards the deep archive of the Yamuna that is both in people's memory, in popular representations, and in the archive itself, you encounter right at the end a video projection. I leave you here with this dissolving elephant. The elephant actually comes together only to disintegrate again in an endless loop. Thank you.